Welcome to AppStories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Spark by Riedel. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, as always, is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John Voorhees. How are you?
You sound very serious today, Federico. I don't know if it's the lack of sleep or you're just being serious.
No, I was serious. You called me Mr. Viticci a while back, and I felt like also being a professional myself today.
Yeah, well, we are very professional here at AppStories.
We try to be sometimes, but not always.
We do. We get a little silly once in a while. But you know what? We're going to talk today about widgets. But before we get to that, I want to just remind everybody, especially since we have some new listeners, we're featured on the Apple Podcast app. So I assume we've got some additional listeners right now. We're doing a daily series during WWDC, going over a whole bunch of the new stuff that we've seen. Federico and I have been binging the sessions every day.
Binge. That's a new hobby.
It is. We've got that going on, and we've got, we're scouring Twitter and the web and just coming up with all the details for everyone so you don't have to do it. Mm-hmm. And not only do we have a lot going on AppStories, where we're doing a daily series all this week, we've also got lots and lots of stories going up every day on MacStories.net. So check that out. We have posted our overviews of all the big OS updates. We've had link posts to various smaller details that have come out throughout the week. We're going to do a collection, a roundup of all the interesting details that we've found so far in the sessions and a whole lot more. So it's kind of a busy week for us, but it's a lot of fun too.
Yeah. And it's especially fun to be at home. And like I was thinking about this today, how different and kind of business as usual it is at the same time. It's
Right.
different because unlike when I'm in San Jose for WWDC, I feel like I have a much better sense of like what are all the features in the new version of iOS and what are all the details. And I have the beta already installed on all my devices, as we mentioned yesterday. And I have my notes already sort of almost organized. They're not in perfect shape, of course, but I'm getting there. So I do have a better sense of what's new in iOS and iPadOS. And that's different because usually, I don't. Usually I'm in town and I go to the sessions and I don't have time to install the beta. And I just try to get as much technical information as possible, but I don't actually try the new OS myself. So that's different. But it does feel the same because like today I was just sitting down and watching sessions and taking notes. And I thought, well, this is kind of like going to WWDC and taking notes for technical stuff. And then True. I also realized that yesterday for dinner, I had a wrap, which is also what I usually have at the WWDC. And that happened accidentally. Like Sylvia didn't know that the wrap is usually my favorite food for WWDC, the takeaway lunches that they have.
Sure.
So I realized, that's why it felt so usual. Yes.
That's hilarious. Mm-hmm. No, I know what you mean. It's funny because it's been very much a typical week for us in a way, but a very, very busy week, much more busy than usual. And yes, the day one, Monday, was a very long day leading into today. But we want to cover today, we want to talk about widgets because widgets is something that's cross-platform. You're going to find these on the iPhone, the iPad, and the Mac, and they're all based on Swift UI. And it's a really interesting addition to the iPhone particularly. And we'll get into that. There's definitely some limitations around this that I'm not too excited about, but it's a very interesting concept that is a lot like what you and I talked about during our iOS and iPadOS wishes, which is developers can create 3 sizes of widgets, which are dynamic content that sit on the home screen in 3 different sizes. There's like a 2x2, a 2x3, and I think a 3x3 grid in terms of the icons. It kind of takes up the same sort of space and shape as icons would on your home screen. And you can fill that with whatever apps provide those sorts of widgets by going into edit mode, hitting the plus button, and then installing whatever's available. There's like a gallery that pops up when you do that to show you what's available. And right now on the betas, it's just Apple's apps, obviously. It's things like weather and stocks and reminders and that sort of thing.
Right, and it was very interesting to hear Apple's explanation of why they wanted to make widgets and what were some of the goals for widgets in iOS and iPadOS 14. And there are some differences, right, between iOS and iPadOS, which we're gonna get to
Right.
in a few minutes. But before we do that, I think it's important that we familiarize ourselves with these goals because they help inform the nature of widgets, and they give us a better understanding of what Apple was trying to achieve and some of the maybe we can also contextualize some of the limitations. So
Absolutely.
what really stood out to me was the idea that Apple wanted to prioritize glanceability for widgets, so to make widgets as glanceable as possible. And they gave a really interesting number in one of the sessions. They said that on average, like the average person goes back to the home screen over 90 times each day. So that's
Right.
almost 100 times that you go back and forth between apps and the home screen on your iPhone. And because of that, they wanted to make sure that widgets could be as glanceable. They could pack as much information as possible in a design that could be intuitive and that could make it easy for you to get a specific data point or a specific piece of information at a glance, right? Because of these quick interactions of going back and forth between apps on the home screen. And they also mentioned how they were able to leverage a lot of the work that they previously put into complications for watchOS, which, as we're going to talk about, they now mostly share a lot of like common foundation stuff in the form of SwiftUI, for example. But the
Right.
idea being that just like on the watch, you want to make sure that you raise your wrist, you see something, it's useful to you, it's glanceable, and you can tap it and you can instantly jump into a specific app or a specific portion of an app. The same story is true for widgets. You want to see something that is glanceable, gives you a piece of information immediately in a couple of seconds. You don't want to wait for data to load. You want to make sure that a widget is always ready for you to take a look at. And you want to make sure that you can tap it and you instantly go into the associated app that provides the widget. So I thought that parallel with watchOS and complications and the idea of these are not mini apps, as we're going to talk about in a few minutes. These are glanceable tiles that give you something in a couple of seconds. I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, important to kind of understand that there are a couple of different kinds of widgets that Apple foresees people creating. There's one set which are kind of static in the sense that they're not based on user-created content. So, for example, the activity app that shows you how how far you're along in closing your rings and things, and that is fed through your movement and the sensors on the iPhone, but you're not actually like typing in text or anything, as opposed to a more dynamic one where you're adding information somehow. Maybe you're, I don't know, putting in information into day one, or you're adding notes to your notes, or you're adding reminders to the reminders app, and that's changing the content in those apps, which is then reflected in the widgets. And so it's kind of interesting to understand those two different types of widgets, because they also play into how they update, because there's this timeline approach that Apple's taking that's very much like the watch, where the system will anticipate when a widget needs to be refreshed. So, for instance, weather periodically throughout the day has to be refreshed so you have current temperatures. The system will anticipate when those things should happen, but developers can also influence that through the intents and the work that they do on the back end to let the system know how often that should happen in the background, or if something's edited inside an app.
Right. And I thought that was also very interesting to hear the technical explanation of it, because I think it's very fascinating how there's the timeline approach, right? That is using SwiftUI,
Right.
that is using snapshots, which are basically it gives you an idea of the kind of stuff that SwiftUI was designed to accomplish, right? It was designed for this kind of fast, lightweight, and asynchronous delivery of data, right? So you have SwiftUI providing that very fast, very quick a delivery of information from the host app to the widget. But I found it interesting how there's the system that is taking care of this timeline, right? That has this series of views that are basically what you're gonna see in the widget, and this series of times where the timeline where when the widget will be refreshed. And most of the time the system takes care of following this timeline. However, there's a bunch of ways in which you can intervene and say, well, actually this widget should be refreshed now. And a very basic example would be you have the calendar widget, which shows you a list of your upcoming events, for example. But if you go into the calendar app and you change an event, obviously the widget is going to refresh and it's going to give you that fresh set of events with your modifications. But also there's the fact that on device intelligence is using machine learning to determine what's the most appropriate widget, what's the most appropriate piece of information, what's the most relevant widget that you want to see right now. And that is going to be reflected in things like the Smart Stack, which is this feature that we mentioned yesterday, which is essentially an intelligent collection of widgets that automatically rotate throughout the day based on what you need. And that is sort of like an evolution of what we used to have before, the Siri suggestions, that throughout the day you would see in search a collection of app icons that were recommended to you, or maybe things like shortcuts on the lock screen. And this is essentially, as we're going to talk about shortly, speaking of shortcuts and intents, this is roughly the same approach. And at the very foundational level, a lot of technology is shared between these features, because you do also have those shortcuts and powering those intents that are also going to be part of widgets now. So I think it's very fascinating how Apple is able now to take advantage of a series of different technologies, machine learning, shortcuts, intents, parameters, all these existing features that can now be sort of remixed and reshuffled and used for a different functionality in the form of widgets. And I think it's very interesting when you think about it, how so much of the groundwork was laid years ago. Intents, for example, Apple first released them as part of iOS 10 for the original SiriKit integrations. That was 4 years ago at this point.
I know it's a pretty long time ago now when you think about it. And I think that's a super important theme across a lot of the things we're talking about this week, is that it's these foundational technologies that have been developed over the last 4 or 5 years that are now being used and remixed in different ways on different devices to come up with whole new user features. And I think Smart Stacks is a great example of that. It reminds me a little bit of the Siri watch face on the Apple Watch, which is pretty good, but was never really great. And I don't think really went very far, but it feels like a remix of that in a more useful way. And it'll remain to be seen. We haven't tried this for long enough to really understand how good the on-device intelligence is at surfacing these things at the right time of day. But what I think if you just watch the keynote, you might not have realized that it's not just a static order of widgets in that Smart Stack. They are surfaced based on the kinds of things that you want during different times of the day. So maybe the first thing in the morning, you check your weather every day. And so the weather will be on top when you get up in the morning. And maybe then you go to reminders later in the day and that'll be on the top. So that's the idea, at least. But there's also, you can manually thumb through them and kind of flip through them that way and get through your stack without having to rely necessarily on the on-device intelligence.
Right. Yeah. And I'm very fascinated by the performance and the technical angle here. So the idea that, for example, because of SwiftUI, because of the timeline-based approach behind the scenes that ensures that in the background, widgets are constantly updated. I think it's very interesting how, for example, Apple built this tech in a way that when you go into the widgets gallery, for instance, so when you want to add a new widget, and you see those previews, right, of all the widgets that you can install, those are not static previews. those are live previews. Like the widget that you see in the gallery, the preview is not like a JPEG. It's the actual widget with the current set of data coming
Right.
directly from the host app. And
Yeah, it's using your data, so it makes it a lot more relevant and makes the preview real to the user, which I
right,
think is a great way to do it.
right. And I think it's a very important point because, again, if the goal of widgets, besides being glanceable, besides being relevant and being customizable, which we're going to talk about shortly, but if the main goal is to be glanceable, I think it's so important to make sure that you have an engine that can make sure that those widgets refresh quickly. And I mean, obviously, right now it's the first beta, so I am seeing some slower than usual refresh times,
Uh-huh.
especially on my iPhone. Obviously, that's totally to be expected because it's the first developer beta. But I think the end goal is to make sure that you never see a loading spinner, right? When you install when you scroll your widgets, and if that should happen, Apple also built this way for developers to provide you with a placeholder image, actually with placeholder content. So, for example, we've seen some screenshots in the sessions of what happens if maybe the calendar widget or the notes widget isn't ready to show you data. And in the case you're gonna see an empty widget, however, it's gonna feature the notes UI or the calendar UI. So you do get, it's not like you get a completely white tile that is entirely empty. You are gonna get some placeholder data in there, and it's gonna look like the app. But again, usually that shouldn't be the case because the system that Apple designed is wants to make sure that you always get your data quickly and invisibly in the background, which I think it's a really important point.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Spark by Readle. Email can feel awful sometimes, but you know what? It's possible to make it feel nice and easy again. With Spark, you can do just that and love your email again. The power and versatility of Spark starts with its smart inbox. It's a unique feature that surfaces the very most important messages, the ones you need to see and respond to right away, ones from people instead of mailing lists. Pin and reply to the most important messages and archive the rest. It's fast, simple, and efficient. A couple of my favorite features are the ability to set up messages for sending later and the ability to create follow-up reminders. Spark also includes powerful search functionality, smart notifications, templates, message snoozing, quick canned replies to messages, and powerful integrations with some of the most popular task managers and other apps, making Spark the centerpiece of a productive workday. There's even a built-in calendar to help you coordinate your day too. The coolest and most unique feature of Spark is its team collaboration. It allows you to privately discuss messages in line in a chat with colleagues, draft messages together, and do things like share attachments and delegate messages to your teammates. Spark works across the iPhone, iPad, Apple Watch, and Mac. It's there for you whenever you need it. On top of everything else, Spark is secure and private, meeting all the requirements of GDPR. Check out Spark today and experience the future of email. I think you're going to love it. You can go to sparkmailapp.com to learn more or use the link in the show notes so they know you came from AppStories. Our thanks to Readle and Spark for supporting AppStories and all of our WWDC coverage. We should probably back up just a tiny bit and explain a little bit about adding widgets and accessing widgets because it works very much like you would expect in terms of editing your home screen, right? You long press and you get a plus button up in this where the status bar would be, and you tap on that and it opens up a panel that slides up from the bottom. It's kind of that card view that you're probably used to by now, and it shows all the different widgets that you can install. There's all sorts of things here, including a search box that allows you to search and find ones relevant to what you're looking for. Now, you can install these on your home screen, but you could also install them in the place you would normally find widgets by, swiping to the right and going over there, because when you first install the beta, that's where you're going to find your widgets. You're not going to find them on the home screen by default. You have to actually add them there. Otherwise, they'll be to the left. And I really like the design of a lot of these. I think they look really terrific.
Yeah, and obviously we're gonna have to wait for third-party developers and to see what they come up with. And obviously we should address, I guess, two elephants in the room. It's a very crowded room with two, not one but two elephants.
Yes.
One of them, maybe the bigger one, being that widgets will not support interactions. So
Right.
you may be used to, especially if you follow MacStories and if you listen to AppStories, you know, the kinds of apps that we like to cover. You may be used to certain kinds of widgets that feature a lot of different commands in the widget and a lot of UI. Things like calculator widgets, like the pcalc widget, or clipboard managers that also feature widgets that have like plus buttons and arrows to scroll a list of content. Well,
Or
all these
drafts or timery,
right,
or all those
timery
things, right?
to start specific timers. Well, and to have widgets, right, that when you tap something, it updates the contents of the widget in line, like the timery widget. You tap on a timer and it starts, and you see the widget update itself with the ongoing timer, right? All those kinds of interactions will no longer be supported with the new widget system, which is called WidgetKit, by the way. The API for developers is called WidgetKit. And that's because Apple stressed in the sessions, and this will be a highly contentious point, I think, and it'll be an ongoing debate at the very least until next year, that these are not meant to be mini apps. These are meant to be glanceable widgets that show you data, but you're not supposed to interact with that data. You're supposed to take a look at these widgets, and if you want, you can tap on them to launch an app or to launch a specific section of an app. One example could be the music widget, for example, that in the medium and large configurations, the widget can have multiple touch targets for things like multiple playlists or multiple albums. So you can tap on individual albums to go there in Apple Music, but you cannot do things like having a calculator in a widget or having a grid of timers and tap on them and the timer starts inside the widget. You can only take a look, so glance at the widget, and you can tap it, but tapping the widget will always launch the app.
Yes, because they're deep links. They, you know, even when you have multiple albums, they're deep links into the music app to that particular album. They're not actually play buttons playing the album. It opens the app and then it plays it. Yeah, and to me, this goes all the way back to the very genesis of widgets, right? And people like James Thompson, who really pushed the envelope and created a calculator app that worked in the widget. And initially, if I recall correctly, James's pcalc was rejected by Apple, and eventually they relented. I think that this is kind of the view that Apple has had of widgets going all the way back to those days, but they're only really trying to, I think they're finally trying to enforce that in a way. And you listen to that session, and you can tell that they understand that there's going to be pushback on this point, because they emphasize over and over that these are not mini apps. And personally, I find that disappointing. I think that there should be some interactivity. I appreciate that they're meant to be glanceable. I think the glanceability and the updating and the information that they deliver is fantastic, but I still do really want to be able to start my timers for timery or, you know, do a quick calculation with pcalc. I think it's a little too much to take away that functionality.
Yeah, and right now the framework that they're using, I agree with you. The framework that they're using with the timeline approach is really meant to load data in the background and show you data. It's really not designed for input. It's really not designed for inline operations. So I do believe that we are going to miss this functionality. Thankfully, it seems like while the old developer framework has been deprecated, it seems like old style widgets will stick around, so you will continue to be able to use them. At the very least, they are still working in the first developer beta of iOS 14.
Yes.
But obviously, they're going to stick out so much on the home screen because they're going to look so different. So you're going to be able to use them. Maybe my hope, my personal theory, is that you will be able to use them until next year, when Apple will maybe have another type of widgets that developers can create that will support interactions. But right
Well,
now,
that would be nice.
that would be nice. So if you're a developer, you will be able to choose, do I want to have an interactive widget or do I want to have a glanceable widget? If we keep complaining about this, I really think it will happen.
I think we should complain, but I also think that the widgets are a very good start, and I do
Yes.
enjoy them.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the other elephant,
The
Federico,
smaller
and I'm gonna
one,
let-
the nephew,
smaller elephant.
the nephew of the bigger elephant.
Yes, I want you to cover this because this has to do with the iPad.
Right. So this was very surprising to me, and I'm not sure I fully understand the reasoning for it. But essentially, widgets on the home screen, the idea of intermixing widgets and app icons on the main grid of the home screen, that's an iPhone only feature. On the iPad, widgets, even the new ones, the new glanceable widgets, will continue to be confined to the left column of the iPad home screen. On the iPad, you cannot drag a widget out of the left column and place it anywhere among the app icons. That's an iPhone only feature. And I'm not sure I fully understand or agree with the motivations, the explanations that Apple gave. Yes, it's true. The iPad and iPhone are technically different. Yes, it's true. The iPad has a dock, which allows you to fit more icons, but that doesn't really explain why shouldn't I be able to have widgets on the iPhone home screen. In fact, I would say that widgets on the home screen, widgets intermixed with app icons, actually make more sense on a bigger home screen, right? Where you have so much more space, when you have so much more freedom to choose exactly the kind of layout you want. And yes, I do understand that glanceable widgets are ideal for the iPhone, especially because of those over 90 times a day that the average person goes back and forth between apps and the home screen. I do understand that. However, I really believe that it would make so much more sense to also have that feature on the iPad, because why not?
Not only do they not work on the biggest screen, Federico, but I just sent you a screenshot of the widgets working on the tiniest home screen, which is the iPod Touch, where you can get them on the home screen.
Of course,
as well.
because it's basically the iPhone UI. So yeah,
Yes.
I'm really sad. Actually, I'm just bummed, honestly, that this doesn't work on the iPad, because I thought, like, for the first 20 minutes that I was using iPadOS 14, I thought it was broken. I thought I had some kind of bug that I tried to drag widgets out of the left column and I just couldn't add them to the home screen. And then I went on Twitter and I saw other people complaining and I realized, oh, this is not a bug. This was done on purpose. And yeah, I really hope that Apple changes its mind here, because yes, glanceable widgets, I understand why. They're saying that they make more sense on the iPhone. But why though? Why not have them on the iPad as well? So I really struggle to see, besides the obvious answer of we ran out of time and we couldn't bring them to the iPad home screen. And maybe there's some other technical reasons that I don't understand, that I can't understand personally. But whatever the motivation, I hope it happens eventually. And I hope that we get widgets on the home screen on the iPad, just like on the iPhone.
Yeah, I hope so too. Another technical thing that I think is really kind of cool to try to reverse this and get a little optimistic again, which is that these are based on extensions so that one app can drive more than one widget. So your weather app could drive multiple weather widgets. You could have one for Rome and one for Chicago and another for New York. You could have all these cities. If you want to have nothing but a weather home screen, you could do it. And they're not independent. They're all driven by that weather app, which is kind of neat, I think.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's so important to note how the Intents API and parameters will play a role in this with the new glanceable widgets in iOS 14,
Right.
because for example, if you take a look at if you have iOS 14 on your device right now and you take a look at the reminders widget, you will see how reminders allows you to choose. When you configure the widget, you can choose which list do you want to see in the widget. And that list, I believe, is based on the same parameter tag that you see in shortcuts. You can you are effectively in the widget, you are effectively choosing a parameter, the parameter being the list that you want to display in the widget. So I think it's super important and fascinating to see how Apple always does this, right? They launch a technology that does, developer framework that does something. And over the years, they continue to refine that, but they also continue to use that work to power other previously unexpected and unforeseen features. So I really believe, and I tweeted about this yesterday, I really believe that intents and like the entire Siri kit and parameter story, I really think it's one of the most important developer frameworks that Apple has right now, because it powers so many different features, from Siri integrations to shortcuts to Siri suggestions and now widgets. And it's also compatible with the watch, of course. So it's not just the iPhone and iPad, but there's also the watch to consider, and the HomePod. And when you add in
And the Mac.
And the Mac, and when you add in stuff like conversational shortcuts, which are also based on parameters and intents, it's so important to see all these pieces coming together, widgets being just a new expression of it. And I mean, of course, there's a lot of work that Apple put in with the new technology, with WidgetKit, with SwiftUI, and the timeline-based approach. But at the core of it, the idea of leveraging intents and parameters and existing work that developers have already done, I think it should accelerate the adoption of these new types of widgets so much that I do believe it's going to be one of the features that we're going to see the most come September or October, whenever iOS is going to come out. I think we're going to get a lot of widgets on the App Store.
Yeah, and we've seen that in the past with this technology and its expansion over the years. And I don't think you can understate how important it is to the ecosystem at large. It really is one of the drivers of innovation on all of these platforms at the same time. And, just to kind of diverge over to the Mac for just a second, this reminds me so much of Dashboard, Federico. I mean, down to the fact that when you tap on the widgets, they flip over and let you do the customization on the backside.
That's what was reminding
Right?
me of. Oh,
Yeah,
thank you. I've been thinking about it all day. Like, where have I seen this before? It's totally the Dashboard.
It's absolutely from Dashboard. And you're going to see the exact same look from widgets both on iOS, iPadOS, and on macOS, because widgets are available there as well. And it's now there's Control Center on the Mac, which is brand new, but you've still got Notification Center, and Notification Center has changed a lot. The notifications are up on top, below the notification, and they're all, we'll talk about those maybe another time, but those are all kind of consolidated by app and grouped up at the top. And down below, you've got the widgets, and the widgets work and look an awful lot like they do on iOS and iPadOS. And so I think it's just going to be a nice, consistent experience for people working across all the devices, that those things will be available there as well. And I really think they fit in very nicely on the Mac too. All right, Federico. Well, we made it through another day. The coffee helps an awful lot, don't you think?
Yeah, even though a lot of coffee and very little sleep is not a good combo, so I'm gonna try and do better in the next few days. But yes, coffee is the fuel this week.
Yeah. You don't
more
want to
than usual. More than usual.
You don't. You don't want to see us after we crash, which absolutely does happen. It's at some point during the day. All right. Well, we're going to be back again tomorrow. I want to thank our sponsor for this episode, and that is Spark, the awesome email app from Riedel. Riedel is sponsoring not just this show, but all of MacStories during WWDC. So we thank them for that. And of course, you can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net and at Club MacStories and all the other places that you can find us. And Federico is on Instagram and Twitter. He's at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you tomorrow, Federico.
Ciao, John.